The rain came down in slanting silver needles over the Oslofjord on the night of March 12, 1943, drumming against the corrugated iron roof of the German naval depot at Horten like 1,000 impatient fingers. Inside Workshop 7, the air hung thick with the scent of machine oil, wet wool, and the faint metallic tang of ozone from a faulty transformer that no one had bothered to fix. At 11:47 p.m., Gunnar Voss, 28, thin-wristed, with ink-stained fingers and a permanent stoop from years hunched over wiring diagrams, paused in the act of resoldering a relay on a Type 7 U-boat's radio console. His breath fogged the cold glass of the single high window. Outside, the silhouette of U-508 loomed against the harbour lights, its conning tower slick with rain, its diesel vents exhaling warm vapour into the frigid air. Gunnar wasn't a saboteur by training. He was a civilian electrician, conscripted into maintaining the Reich's undersea fleet after Norway's surrender in 1940. His only weapon was silence. His only rebellion, a hesitation, a millisecond delay in tightening a bolt, a deliberate misalignment of a terminal block that might cause a short weeks later, deep in the Atlantic. But tonight was different. Tonight he'd seen something, 3 hours earlier. While replacing a blown capacitor in U-508's Funkerette C-42 transmitter, Gunnar had noticed a discrepancy in the grounding circuit. Every U-boat he'd serviced since 1941 routed its radio ground through the hull's copper sheathing, a standard practice to dissipate static and stabilize frequency. But U-508's ground wire had been rerouted through a secondary bus bar connected to the starboard ballast tank valve assembly. It made no electrical sense. Worse, it introduced impedance. Gunnar had traced the wire with his fingertips, feeling the subtle vibration of the ship's idling diesels travel up the copper strand like a pulse. He'd tested the resistance, 3.7 ohms, higher than specification, enough to distort signal harmonics, enough perhaps to make transmissions slightly noisier, more detectable. He mentioned it to Oberleutnant Zur C. Reinhardt during the evening inspection. "Ground wires off spec," Gunnar said, voice low, eyes on the deck grating. "Who could cause harmonic bleed on long-range bursts?" Reinhardt barely glanced up from his clipboard. "The Kriegsmarine doesn't ask Norwegian electricians to redesign naval architecture. But if Huff Duff stations are already triangulating, then they'll keep triangulating," Reinhardt snapped, stepping closer, his polished boots clicking on the steel floor. "You solder. You don't theorize." "Understood?" Gunnar nodded, throat tight. He returned to his bench, hands trembling not from fear, but from the unbearable clarity of what he'd just realized. The Germans weren't just losing U-boats to Allied hunters. They were announcing their positions with every transmission, thanks to a grounding flaw no engineer had questioned because it's always been done this way. That night, alone in the workshop after curfew, Gunnar did something reckless. He didn't sabotage, he corrected. Using a length of surplus tinned copper wire and a pair of insulated cutters, smuggled from his father's pre-war radio shop in Bergen, he snipped the faulty ground lead on U-508's transmitter and reconnected it directly to the main hull ground point, a modification so simple it bordered on absurd, no tools beyond what any apprentice carried. No schematics altered, just a single cut, a twist, a solder joint hidden beneath a rubber grommet. If discovered, it would be dismissed as routine maintenance. If unnoticed, it might render the boat's radio transmissions cleaner, quieter, harder to detect. He worked by the dim glow of a hooded lantern, sweat beading on his upper lip despite the cold. Every creak of the building, every distant footfall on the pier, sent his pulse hammering against his ribs. At 1:03 a.m. he finished. He wiped his hands on his overalls, extinguished the lamp, and slipped out through the rear service door into the rain-slick alley behind the depot. As he walked home through the sleeping town, the fjord black and endless to his left, he felt not triumph but dread. He hadn't just fixed a wire, he'd planted a seed of doubt in the heart of the U-boat war, and seeds, once sown, couldn't be unplanted. 3 days later, U-508 departed Horten for its 7th patrol, bound for the mid-Atlantic Gap. Gunnar watched from the breakwater, hands in his pockets, collar turned up against the wind. He didn't know if his modification would work. He didn't know if anyone would notice the difference. But as the boat's diesel engines coughed to life and its bow cut through the chop, he saw something else. The radio mast, rigid against the grey sky, no longer humming with that faint, telltale resonance he'd felt in his fingertips. It stood silent, still, and in that silence something shifted. The North Atlantic in April 1943 was a theatre of ghosts. Fog clung to the waves like burial shrouds, and the wind carried the metallic scent of distant storms. 200 miles west of the Azores, U-508 rode low in the swells, its diesel exhaust dissipating into the overcast sky. Its crew moving through their routines with the weary precision of men who had stared too long into the abyss. Below deck, Funkmaat Erich Vogel tapped out a routine weather report on the C-42 transmitter, fingers stiff from the damp cold. The signal pulsed into the ether at 14.2 megahertz, clean, sharp, devoid of the usual harmonic fuzz that had plagued earlier patrols. Vogel didn't notice. To him, it was just another transmission. But 3,000 kilometers away, in a stone-walled intercept station near Land's End, Corporal Helen Price frowned at her cathode ray display. The trace was there, brief, precise, but the usual broadband noise that accompanied U-boat bursts was absent. She noted it in the log, U-508, 0417-43, 032Z, signal unusually narrowband. Possible equipment change? Her supervisor skimmed the entry and filed it under anomalies low priority. Gunnar Voss knew nothing of this. Back in Horten, he was assigned to U-461, a supply submarine undergoing refit after a near miss with the Liberator off Cape Finisterre. The depot buzzed with rumors. Convoy losses were mounting, but so were U-boat sinkings. In March alone, 16 German submarines had vanished, more than in all of 1941. Morale among the Norwegian civilian workforce had plummeted, not from loyalty to the Reich, but from fear of reprisals if sabotage was suspected. Gunnar kept his head down, rewired junction boxes, replaced blown fuses, and listened. He overheard Kriegsmarine engineers grumbling about phantom losses, boats that transmitted normally, then simply ceased to exist. No distress calls, no debris fields, just silence. One evening, while calibrating a direction-finding loop antenna on the depot's roof, Gunnar intercepted a fragment of a conversation between two German radio officers. Huff-duff bearings are tighter than ever, one said, lighting a cigarette with gloved hands. They're getting us within 10 nautical miles now, sometimes less. The new cavity magnetron sets? Maybe. Or maybe we're leaking more than we think. Gunnar's stomach tightened. He descended the ladder slowly, his boots echoing on the metal rungs. That night, in his tiny flat above a shuttered bakery, he spread out smuggled technical manuals on his kitchen table. British Admiralty pamphlets passed through the underground, marked with red ink and coffee stains. He cross-referenced German grounding schematics with Allied interception protocols. What emerged was a terrifying symmetry, the very flaw he'd corrected on. U-508, the impedance introduced by the U-ballast tank ground path, was amplifying the electromagnetic signature of every transmission, making U-boats glow like lighthouses to the new British high-frequency direction-finding arrays. The modification he'd made wasn't just a fix. It was camouflage, but proving it required evidence. And evidence required another boat. His chance came with U-634, a newly commissioned Type 7C undergoing final checks before its maiden patrol. Gunnar was assigned to inspect its radio room, a routine task easily overlooked. On the night of April 22nd, during a simulated transmission drill, he lingered after the German crew departed. With practiced hands, he replicated the same wire cut and reroute he'd performed on U-508. This time, he added a subtle twist. He insulated the new ground joint with a sliver of rubber salvaged from a bicycle inner tube, something that would degrade slowly, ensuring the fix wouldn't be discovered during routine maintenance for weeks. As he slipped out, rain began to fall again, washing the oil from his palms, erasing his fingerprints from the steel bulkhead. U-634 sailed on April 28th. 2 weeks later, a decrypted Kriegsmarine signal reached B-Dienst headquarters in Berlin. U-634 reports successful transit through Bay of Biscay. No Allied aircraft sightings. Unusual quiet on HF bands. The message was dismissed as wishful thinking, but in the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, analysts noted a troubling gap. For the first time in months, no confirmed HFDF fix had been logged on a U-boat transiting the bay during peak patrol rotation. Coincidence, they assumed. Weather interference. Equipment malfunction. Gunner heard none of this. What he did hear was the silence in Workshop 7. Fewer U-boats returning. Fewer crews laughing in the mess hall. More empty berths at the pier. And then, on May 5th, the knock came. 2 Gestapo officers stood at his door at dawn, their trench coats damp with mist, their eyes flat and unreadable. They didn't arrest him. They asked questions. Had he worked on U-508? On U-634? Had he noticed anything unusual about their radio systems? Gunnar answered with careful monotony, citing standard procedures, worn components, humidity damage. They searched his flat, turned over his books, tested his radio for hidden transmitters. Finding nothing, they left, but not before one of them leaned close and whispered, "We know Norwegians have long memories. Just remember, wires can be traced back to the hand that cut them." That night, Gunnar didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the harbor lights flicker on the black water. He knew he couldn't repeat the modification, not openly. But the idea was out there now, replicable, invisible, scalable. And if even 2 boats were transmitting cleanly, the pattern would begin to fracture. The Allies would grow uncertain. Bearings would blur, convoy routes would shift. And in that uncertainty, the tide might turn, not with a battle, but with a whisper. By mid-May 1943, the North Atlantic had become a killing field, but not for the convoys. U-boat losses reached catastrophic levels, 41 submarines destroyed in a single month, the highest in the war. In the dimly lit war room beneath the Admiralty, red pins marking U-boat sinkings clustered so densely around convoy routes that junior officers began calling it Black May. Yet amid the carnage, a quiet anomaly emerged. Intelligence logs from HFDF stations in Iceland, Northern Ireland, and Nova Scotia noted a growing number of ghost transmissions, brief, clean bursts that registered on receivers but yielded no actionable bearings. Bearings that should have been precise within 5 nautical miles, instead scattered across a 100-mile radius, as if the signals were slipping through the net. At first, analysts blamed atmospheric ducting or equipment drift. But when 3 separate stations reported the same phenomenon on May 18th, 2 attributed to U-508, 1 possibly to U-634, the pattern hardened into a question. Were the Germans changing their radio discipline, or had something fundamental shifted in their transmission physics? Gunnar Voss, unaware of this distant scrutiny, moved like a shadow through Horten. The Gestapo's visit had chilled him into stillness. He performed his duties with mechanical precision, spoke only when spoken to, and avoided the radio rooms unless ordered. But his mind raced. He'd heard whispers from dock workers. U-508 had returned to Lorient on May 12th, its crew exhausted but intact, having sunk a lone freighter and evaded 3 hunter-killer groups. U-634 was still unaccounted for, but no Kriegsmarine bulletin listed it as lost. That absence was its own kind of signal. Then came the breakthrough he hadn't dared hope for. On May 21st, a damaged Type 9 boat, U-188, limped into Horten with a fractured pressure hull and a dead radio room. Its transmitter had been fried by a near-miss depth charge, and the Kriegsmarine ordered it cannibalized for parts. Gunnar was assigned to strip the C-42 unit. As he removed the grounding assembly, his fingers found it instantly. The same flawed routing through the ballast valve bus bar, untouched, unmodified. But this time, he had permission to dismantle it completely. In the privacy of Workshop 7's backbench, Under the pretense of inventorying components, he reconfigured the ground path exactly as he had on U-508 and U-634. He didn't just fix it, he documented it. Using a smuggled Leica camera, he took 3 blurred but legible photographs of the modified circuit, labeling them with grease pencil on the film canister. Ground impedance, noise, direct hull ground, silence. He passed the film to a contact in the Norwegian. Resistance, a fishmonger who ferried supplies to coastal patrols, knowing it would reach London within 10 days via a fishing trawler bound for Shetland. He didn't know if anyone would believe it. He only knew that if the Allies understood why some U-boats were vanishing from their detection nets, they might stop hunting the wrong ghosts. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, U-634 finally broke radio silence on May 24th. From a position 300 miles south of Greenland, it transmitted a short situation report. The signal was received clearly by the German naval station in Lorient, but at the British HFDF array in Londonderry, the bearing plotter spun uselessly. No convergence, the operator reported. Signal present, but non-directional, like it's coming from everywhere and nowhere. The report was filed, then forgotten in the chaos of Black May's aftermath. Back in Germany, however, unease festered. Admiral Karl Dönitz, shaken by the losses, ordered a technical review of all U-boat radio systems. A team of engineers from Kiel arrived in Horten on June 1st, armed with oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers. They inspected 5 boats at random. On U-508, they found gunner's modification. They assumed it was factory error, a miswired unit from Siemens, and ordered it corrected back to standard configuration. Gunner watched from a gantry above as a German technician snipped his clean ground wire and reattached it to the ballast bus bar. His stomach dropped. He said nothing, but the seed had already sprouted. In London, Gunner's photographs arrived on June 5th, tucked inside a crate of salted herring. They landed on the desk of Commander Alistair Finch, a taciturn signals expert with the operational research section. Finch had spent months trying to explain the erratic HFDF results. When he saw the photos, he didn't scoff. He replicated the circuit in a lab at HMS Dolphin, the Royal Navy's submarine school. Using a salvaged German transmitter and a simulated hull ground, he ran tests. The results were unequivocal. The standard Kriegsmarine grounding introduced a 3.54 ohm impedance that broadened the signal's spectral footprint by 18 kHz, enough to make it glow like a beacon to British receivers. The direct hull ground reduced that spread to under 2 kHz, rendering the signal nearly indistinguishable from background noise at ranges beyond 50 kilometers. Finch immediately drafted a classified memo. Recommend immediate dissemination to all HFDF stations. Expect reduced detection efficacy against U-boats employing direct hull grounding. Pattern suggests limited but growing adoption. The Admiralty hesitated. Was this a German countermeasure or a fluke? Without confirmation from multiple sources, they refused to alter convoy tactics. But Finch, knowing time was short, took a risk. He quietly shared the findings with Captain F.J. Johnny Walker, commander of the 2nd Support Group, the Royal Navy's most aggressive U-boat hunter. Walker, a man who trusted instinct over bureaucracy, adjusted his patrol patterns. He ordered his destroyers to rely less on HFDF fixes and more on sonar and visual sweeps in high-risk zones. On June 14th, Walker's group encountered U-634 southwest of Ireland. The boat had just surfaced to recharge batteries when HMS Starling's radar picked it up at 8,000 yards, closer than any HFDF fix would have allowed. Depth charges sank it in 90 seconds. No radio transmission was sent. No bearing was logged. The boat simply vanished, as so many now did. But in the wreckage recovered days later, divers found something odd. The radio room's ground wire had been cleanly cut and rerouted. The modification was still in place. The discovery of the modified grounding circuit in U-634's wreckage sent a tremor through British naval intelligence, not because it confirmed a German innovation, but because it suggested something far more unsettling, a flaw so fundamental it had been overlooked for years, now being quietly corrected by someone inside the enemy's own system. Commander Finch, summoned to a midnight meeting in the Admiralty's map room, laid out his findings on a grease-stained chart table. "This isn't a new German tactic," he said, voice low but urgent. "It's a repair. Someone on their side realized their radios were too loud and started fixing them." The room fell silent. If true, it meant the Kriegsmarine's losses weren't just due to Allied superiority, but to self-inflicted vulnerability. And that vulnerability was now being patched boat by boat, wire by wire, yet the Germans themselves remained oblivious to the true cause of their earlier failures. The Kiel engineering team, having corrected U-508's wiring back to standard, reported no anomalies. Their conclusion: the erratic HF-DF results were due to Allied jamming or atmospheric interference. Dönitz, desperate to restore morale, ordered all U-boats to adopt new transmission protocols, shorter bursts, randomized frequencies, but left the grounding architecture untouched. The institutional inertia was absolute. If the design had been approved by Berlin in 1939, it could not be wrong in 1943. Gunnar Voss watched this blindness unfold from the periphery. In late June, he was reassigned to the radio workshop aboard the depot ship Tsingtao, moored in the inner harbor. The move was a promotion of sorts, closer to operational hardware, but also a cage. Gestapo informants now shadowed civilian technicians, and every solder joint was logged. Gunnar knew he couldn't repeat his modification openly, but he didn't need to. The idea was replicable, and in the quiet hours between shifts, he began teaching it, not with words, but with hands. He showed a young apprentice, Lars, how to test ground impedance with a multimeter salvage from a downed Ju-88. He demonstrated how a clean hull ground reduced static on receiver tests. He never mentioned U-boats, never spoke of silence or detection, only of better signal fidelity, a phrase bland enough to pass inspection. Lars, sharp-eyed and resentful of the occupation, understood. Within weeks, 2 more boats, U-226 and U-419, left Horten with subtly altered grounding circuits, their modifications hidden beneath insulation tape and routine maintenance logs. By July, the statistical anomaly could no longer be ignored. British HF-DF success rates, which had peaked at 78% in March, dropped to 41% by August. Convoys that should have been ambushed sailed unmolested. U-boats that transmitted daily went weeks without being located. In the Atlantic, the hunter became the hunted not through superior force, but through absence, through the eerie quiet of signals that refused to echo. German naval communiques grew cautiously optimistic, improved radio discipline yielding results, read one internal memo. Allied tracking appears degraded, but the truth was far stranger. On August 17, 1943, U-226 transmitted a routine position report from the mid-Atlantic. The signal was received clearly in Lorient, but at the HF-DF station in Iceland, the cathode ray display showed only a faint, diffuse smear. No bearing, no triangulation. The operator logged it as non-directional anomaly, possible equipment fault. Meanwhile, convoy SC-139, carrying 42 merchant ships and vital war material, passed within 30 miles of U-226's last known position. The U-boat never saw it. It never even knew it was there. Back in Horten, Gunnar received a coded message through the resistance. "Your birds are flying silent. London hears nothing." He burned the note in his stove, watching the edges curl to ash. He felt no pride, only a cold, gnawing fear. Every boat he'd touched was now a ghost. And ghosts, he knew, eventually draw attention. That attention came in September. A Kriegsmarine signals officer, reviewing maintenance logs from U-226 and U-413, noticed a pattern. Both boats had undergone radio repairs by the same Norwegian civilian, Gunnar Voss. Suspicion hardened into investigation. On September 12th, Gestapo agents raided his flat again. This time, they found nothing incriminating, but they didn't need to. They arrested him on charges of sabotage through negligence, a catch-all accusation that required no evidence, only suspicion. He was taken to Møllergata 19, Oslo's infamous prison, and held in cell 14, a concrete box 6 feet by 8 lit by a single bare bulb. Interrogations were methodical, not brutal. They wanted a confession, not a corpse. "You altered wiring," his interrogator said on the third day, sliding a schematic across the table. "Why?" Gunnar shook his head. "I followed the manual. The manual doesn't show that ground path. Then the manual is wrong." The officer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Or you are," but Gunnar held his silence. He knew they couldn't prove intent, and without proof they couldn't execute him, not without risking unrest among the civilian workforce, which the Reich still needed. After 10 days, he was released with a warning: "One more mistake and you'll disappear." He returned to work on September 25th, thinner, paler, but unchanged in purpose. The next day, U-4113 departed on patrol. Gunnar had serviced its radio the week before. He hadn't touched the ground wire. He hadn't needed to. The apprentice Lars had done it for him, and so the silence spread. By October 1943, German U-boat losses had plummeted to just 9 boats, a fraction of Black May's carnage. Dönitz, misreading the cause, credited new tactics and improved morale. In London, Finch and Walker exchanged grim glances over decrypted signals. The U-boats weren't just surviving, they were becoming invisible. The war under the waves was slipping back into shadow, not because of German ingenuity, but because of a single wire cut in a rain-soaked Norwegian workshop, repeated in secret by hands that asked for nothing but the quiet satisfaction of having seen what others refused to see. The winter of 1943-44 settled over the North Atlantic like a lid on a coffin, sealing in the cold, the silence, and the unspoken truth that the tide of the U-boat war had turned, not with a decisive battle, but with a whisper in the static. By December, Allied HFDF stations logged fewer than 20% of expected U-boat transmissions as directionally viable. Convoys sailed with growing confidence, their escorts scanning horizons that remained stubbornly empty. In Berlin, Dönitz declared the crisis over. In London, analysts whispered of a phantom fleet, boats that transmitted yet evaded detection with uncanny consistency. No one on either side grasped the full picture, that the shift had begun not in a laboratory or a command bunker, but in the trembling hands of a civilian electrician who had dared to question a single wire. Gunnar Voss never learned the full impact of his actions. After his release from Møllergata 19, he worked under constant surveillance, his movements tracked, his tools counted at the end of each shift. Yet the modification lived on, passed hand to hand among Norwegian technicians like a secret prayer. Lars, now working independently, altered the grounding on U-760 before its January 1944 patrol. Another apprentice, Ingrid, a rare woman in the depot's technical corps, did the same on U-256 during a routine antenna overhaul. The practice became a silent rebellion, invisible to German inspectors who saw only compliance, only routine maintenance. By early 1944, an estimated 17 U-boats operating out of Norwegian ports carried the modification, though none of their crews knew it. To them, their survival was luck, discipline, or divine favor. The strategic consequences unfolded slowly, then all at once. In February 1944, convoy HX-278 crossed the mid-Atlantic without a single loss, despite known U-boat concentrations nearby. Post-war analysis would reveal that 3 modified boats, U-226, U-4113, and U-760 had transmitted within 100 miles of the convoy's path, yet none were detected. Their signals, clean and narrowband, dissolved into the background hum of the ionosphere, undetectable by even the most advanced British arrays. The Allies, convinced their hunter-killer groups were succeeding through superior tactics, diverted resources to the impending Normandy invasion, unaware that a significant portion of their success was owed to a flaw the enemy had unknowingly corrected. Ironically, the modification's very success sowed the seeds of its obsolescence. As Allied radar, sonar, and code-breaking improved, the radio signature became less critical to U-boat survival. By mid-1944, with air cover extending across the Atlantic and hunter-killer groups operating with near-total impunity, even silent transmissions couldn't save a boat spotted by a liberator's radar. The U-boat arm was being strangled not by signals, but by overwhelming force. Yet in that narrow window, between May 1943 and March 1944, the grounding fix had bought the Kriegsmarine precious months, delaying the collapse of the Atlantic campaign and possibly altering the timing of D-Day. Historians would later estimate that the modification reduced U-boat losses by 22% during its peak adoption. Sparing nearly 40 submarines and their crews from certain destruction, Gunnar Voss survived the war. When German forces withdrew from Norway in May 1945, he walked out of Workshop 7 for the last time, his overalls stained with oil, his hands calloused and steady. He never sought recognition. When British naval investigators arrived in Horten that summer, combing through records for signs of sabotage or espionage, Gunnar said nothing. He watched as they puzzled over maintenance logs, over grounding schematics that made no sense, over the quiet mystery of why some U-boats had slipped through the net. He let them wonder. He returned to Bergen, took a job repairing radios in a small shop near the fish market, and married a schoolteacher who never asked about the war. He never spoke of U-508, of the wire cut in the rain, of the fear that had lived in his bones for 2 years. Only once, late in life, did he mention it, on a foggy morning in 1978, to his grandson, who found an old Leica camera hidden in a drawer. Some things, Gunnar said, are fixed not by shouting but by silence. The legacy of his act endured not in medals or monuments, but in the quiet recalibration of how institutions listen. After the war, both British and American navies revised their electronic warfare protocols, embedding redundancy checks for grounding impedance in all future submarine designs. The lesson was never formalized in doctrine. It was absorbed, like salt into wood, through the humbling realization that expertise can blind as easily as it enlightens, and that the most dangerous flaws are those everyone agrees aren't flaws at all. In the end, the wire cut changed nothing and everything. It did not end the war early. History is too vast for a single hand to steer, but it proved that in the machinery of total war, even the smallest anomaly, noticed and acted upon by an ordinary person, can ripple outward in ways no general, no admiral, no dictator can foresee. And sometimes, in the space between a flawed design and a quiet correction, lies the narrow margin between annihilation and survival.